of government service, he has taught at National Defense University and served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where he was Senior Advisor for Information Strategy. He participated in Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003 as Senior Advisor to the Iraqi Ministry of Information. Before that, he was Director of the Voice of America, where he had worked the prior decade. Mr. Reilly served in the White House as a Special Assistant to the President and in the U.S. Information Agency, both in D.C. and abroad. In the private sector, he spent more than 7 years with the Intercollegiate Studies Institute as both National Director and President. He was on active duty as an armored cavalry officer for 2 years and attended Georgetown University and the Claremont Graduate University. He has published widely on foreign policy, the war of ideas, and classical music. Among these many publications are The Prospects and Perils of Catholic-Muslim Dialogue, Assessing War, and the Assessing War of Ideas During War, and the topic of tonight's talk, The Closing of the Muslim Mind, How Intellectual Suicide Created the Modern Islamist Crisis. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Robert Reilly.
Let me read to you this prayer. O God, I ask of you a perfect faith, a sincere assurance, a reverent heart, a remembering tongue, a good conduct of commendation, and a true repentance. Repentance before death, rest at death, and forgiveness and mercy after death, clemency at the reckoning, victory in paradise, and escape from the fire. By your mercy, O Mighty One, Forgiver. Lord, increase me in knowledge and join me to the good. What do you think of that prayer? Any problem? No, I don't think so. That's the prayer Muslims say on the Hajj in Mecca, the 7th time they go around the Kaaba. And the reason I read it is because it gives an insight into Muslims in the way in which they seek to do the will of God and why. And many of the Muslims I've known are tremendously pious people, prayerful people, observant people, good people. And I have seen, without question, particularly in the lives of those whom I know who have gone through horrors I could not have endured, including limb amputation. It's their faith in God that sustained, I absolutely no doubt, the presence of God in their lives. So the first thing we remember is they are seeking the will of God in the best way it has been given them to do, which is always a matter of respect. The subject of tonight's talk, the closing of the Muslim mind, and the general thesis I lay out in this book, generally takes about 3 hours to cover in the theological, philosophical, epistemological, and moral realms. And that's about how long I have tonight, Melanie, isn't it? Well, let's see if I can sum the whole thing up in one dense sentence. Islamism is a spiritual pathology based upon a deformed theology that has produced a dysfunctional culture. A spiritual pathology, a deformed theology that has produced a dysfunctional culture. Well, that's about it. Any questions? All right. By the way, my publisher did not think that the title of the book, The Closing of the Muslim Mind, was sufficiently incendiary So we came up with this subtitle, How Intellectual Suicide Created the Modern Islamist Crisis. But I would like to tell you from where we got that subtitle. It is from a Muslim, in fact, from one of the best Muslim thinkers of the 20th century, Fazlur Rahman, who was an Indian or Pakistani, who in the first government of the Pakistani state had a ministerial role in education, and he tried to reform education in Pakistan. It was too controversial. He had to leave the country, and he went to the University of Chicago, where some of my friends got their PhDs in Islamic studies under him. So let's hear what Fazlur Rahman said. Quote, "A people that deprives itself of philosophy necessarily exposes itself to starvation in terms of fresh ideas. In fact, it commits intellectual suicide." Unquote. So what we're going to talk about tonight is how, and I should be specific in saying that I'm only going to talk about Sunni Islam, which of course is the vast majority of the Muslim world, 85-90% Sunni rather than Shia. And within the Sunni world, I'm going to concentrate on one theological school called Asherism. But that's the majority theological school of the Sunni world. Now, how many of you remember Benedict XVI's Regensburg Address? Several of you do. If you didn't read that great address, maybe you'll remember the reaction to it, which was explosive in parts of the Muslim world. Because what he said was deeply resented, even though most of the Regensburg Address was about this term he used, the de-Hellenization of the West, meaning the loss of reason, the loss of philosophy. In our case, due to moral relativism, cultural relativism, the abandonment that our minds can come to know objective truth, which after all was the great discovery of Greek philosophy back in the 4th, 5th century BC. So Benedict XVI talked about the de-Hellenization, the loss of reason in the West. But he also spoke of the de-Hellenization of Islam. And as if to prove the point concerning the loss of reason in Islam, there was rioting and violence, and a nun was killed. I forget the specifics of what happened. QED couldn't have been a more powerful illustration of the de-Hellenization of Islam. Now, one way to proceed here with some of these very complex issues is, I think, to take you from something you do know, which is the Bible, to something that you may not know, which is the Quran. Let me ask, how many of you have read the Quran? Ma'am? Okay, we have a couple. Well, it's a very difficult book. Those of you who have looked at it, particularly for someone of a Western orientation, because it's not a narrative. It doesn't have a beginning, middle, end. It's not a story. It tells stories, most of which come from the Bible, but it itself is not a story. In fact, the principle of organization in the Quran is of 114 surahs or chapters, from the longest to the shortest. That's it. They're not arranged chronologically. They're not arranged according to any narrative. That's the way it is. So it's a tough book for a Westerner to read. And I'm going to point out to you some of the things that were particularly prominent the first time I read the Quran that struck me. One is the account of creation. And by the way, in the Quran there are multiple, they don't tell the story once. There are repetitions of the story, each varied in a slightly different way in different parts of the Quran. Now in the Quran, man is emphatically not made in the image and likeness of God. That is the first thing that will strike you as being radically different from Genesis, where, of course, we read that God made us in His image and likeness. That statement is almost like the air we breathe. Even in a secular culture such as it is today, the revelation in Genesis that we were made in the image and likeness of God is the foundation of our civilization. To the extent to which we observe the inalienable human rights that our forefathers pronounced in the Declaration of Independence, we know those were developed on the foundation of the Genesis revelation that we are made in God's image and likeness, which is what makes us inviolable in our persons. This is absent from Islam. And of course, this isn't just Genesis. This is a statement that is repeated throughout the Bible. Just to give you a little sample, elsewhere in the Old Testament, in the Book of Wisdom, quote, "For God formed me to be imperishable. The image of His own nature He made me," unquote. And of course, in the New Testament, we hear from St. John in his extraordinary statement, quote, "Now we are children of God," unquote. Children? We have a familial relationship with God? He's our Father? And as Jesus spoke Aramaic when He taught the Our Father, He used the word Abba, which is more familiar than Father. It's closer to Daddy. Our Daddy who art in heaven. Think of the level of intimacy that suggests between this infinite, transcendent God and these little finite people who are nonetheless made in His image and likeness. And then what happens? Later we hear in St. John, quote, "What we shall be later is not yet clear. But when we see Him, we shall be like Him, for we will see Him as He is." We will be like whom? Like God. We will be like God. And then, of course, at St. Mary's today at Mass, during the offertory, the priest, I think it was Father Scalia, because I looked at the church bulletin, says at the offertory prayer, "By the mystery of this water and wine, may we come to share in the divinity of Christ, who humbled Himself to share in our humanity." Share in the divinity of Christ? I cannot possibly tell you how shocking everything I have just said is to a Muslim. It is considered blasphemous in the extreme to suppose we are in any way like God, that we are in any way comparable to Him, or that we will somehow be like him and actually share in God's life? No. This is blasphemous. So that's the first thing, image and likeness of God. By the way, what would you say is that image and likeness of God in us? What do we mean? I see someone pointed to reason, right? Good. Reason. That's godlike, isn't it? And what else?
Will.
Free will. So reason and free will are godlike. And you can imagine if there's no imago Dei in Islam, you won't be surprised to see both of those things, reason and free will, seriously diminished in the status of human beings. Excuse me. Now, what's the next thing that you might find particularly striking when you're reading the Quran? There's no original sin. There's the first sin, but it's no different than the second sin or the third sin. In each of these cases, Allah, who is always addressed as the All-Merciful, may forgive and we move on, or he may not forgive and simply destroy you. But there's no original sin in the biblical sense of a cataclysmic dislocation in the relationship between man and God, such that man is totally bereft by the loss of this relationship. And of course, he's expelled from the garden, subject to death. And worst of all, he has nothing within his means of sufficient worth to offer this infinite God whom he has just egregiously offended. So the situation seems hopeless until slightly later in Revelation, God says in effect, you can't do this. You haven't within your means. You do not have a means to restore this relationship, but I can do it for you. I will send someone who will do it for you. And thus begins in Revelation the prophecies of who this person may be and what they may do. The suffering servant of Isaiah, and so forth. And here begins salvation history, unique within the Western world, in the sense that time now is no longer circular. Things don't just simply move in a loop. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end to things. All of which can be tracked from both creation, original sin, and the promised restoration of the relationship between man and God through a Messiah, a Savior. That's what begins salvation history. Now, in Islam, there is no salvation history. There is no Savior. There is no Messiah who's going to restore the relationship between man and God, because there was no relationship to begin with. There's nothing to restore. There's just this almighty God and this finite creature who has no ability to know this incomparable, transcendent, omnipotent God who acts for his own reasons unknown to us. So there was no relationship to restore. Now, in the West, we can say history, our sense of history, is a secularization of salvation history. The idea of progress in the West, this linear way we track things, that we have a narrative of beginning, middle, end, the culmination of things, that's a secularization of salvation history, our notion of history. And since Islam had no salvation history to secularize, it is also absent to an alarming degree of the idea of history itself. In other words, there's no narrative there. And this may give you a little insight. And because of this, by the way, there's even a different notion of time in Islam. Why do you suppose it is? By the way, I know we have one Army veteran here, but what do you think in this literature from the Middle East and Afghanistan, what do they call American soldiers? What does Al-Qaeda call us? What does ISIS call us? Crusader? So, yeah, but that's infrequent. Sorry?
Infidels.
Well, infidels, but there's a more common term. Romans. We are the Romans. How could that be? We're from Northern Virginia. Father Hathaway may be in Rome, but so how could we be the Romans? Because that's when Islam thundered out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, that's when they were fighting, were the Byzantines, who called themselves Romans and who were known as Romans. And because of this lack of history as we understand it as a progression through time in a linear way, we're the Romans still. So they understand us as the Romans, just as they understand their mission is to conquer not Washington, D.C., but Rome. Another little example before I move on. Why do you suppose that the ISIS folks so busied themselves in Syria with explosives and jackhammers, destroying Assyrian human-headed winged bulls from the Assyrian Empire, 3,500 years ago? Why were they doing that? The answer is idols. They have to destroy the idols. But for something to be an idol, it has to be idolized. And no one's been around worshiping human-headed winged bulls for 3,500 years. Can't they just leave them alone in museums as a part of the historical, cultural record? No, because all things exist in this sacred time for them simultaneously. They can't make the distinction that they're no longer idols because they're not idolized. There's no history in the sense in that way. Someone said Islam is just simply returns to its beginnings. It's kind of flute that these people want to be back in the 7th century and live as they did in Mecca and Medina. I'm sorry, I spent too much, but does that provide a little insight into what's going on? We're the Romans, destroy the idols. Occasionally you'll hear from the Islamists in Egypt that they need to blow up the pyramids and the Sphinx for the same reason. And of course, the Taliban blew up the Bamiyan Buddha in Afghanistan. Same kind of thing. They have to destroy history. They don't understand history other than it has to be something to destroy. Okay. Now, so no Imago Dei, no original sin. Here's an interesting little thing that if you've read the Quran, you might even have overlooked. Who names the animals? Okay, who names the animals in Genesis? Adam names the animals. And they are what he names them. They're paraded before him. It is Adam who gives them the name. Just as God gave Adam dominion over them, that dominion is expressed by his naming them. So who names the animals in the Quran? Man? No. Allah names the animals. Man hasn't the power to name the animals. Now, naming things is our means by which reality becomes intelligible to us. It's through our naming of things that we apprehend them. If you cannot name things, can you understand them? No. So man in the Quran hasn't the power to name things. Now it gets even more interesting because the angels complain to Allah and say, "What did you make this man for out of a clump of dirt when all he's going to do is cause mischief in your creation?" And Allah is miffed that the angels would have the nerve to remonstrate with him in this matter. So he says, in effect, to them, "Oh yeah? Well, if you're so smart, you tell me the names of the animals." Surely you think the angels would know them, right? These pure spirits, pure intelligences. And what does the angel say? "Oh, you who know all, Allah, you know we don't know the names of the animals. We only know what you tell us." So not even an angel has the rational capability of apprehending reality through naming. What can they know? They can only know what Allah tells them. In other words, please pay attention to this point because it's going to become very important shortly. Their only source of knowledge is revelation, not their intellects, not their reason. Let's talk very briefly about how the Quran considers itself and what it thinks of us and the Jews. Much of this is laid out in the 5th surah in the Quran. Allah says to the Jews, I had a covenant with you. I gave you my word. It's implied that they were given the Holy Land as part of this covenant. And what did the Jews do then? They changed my words. The Jews had the temerity to change Allah's words. As a consequence of which, as it says, "Cursed be the Jews forever." Then Allah said, "All right, the Jews did this terrible thing. I'll do it another time." So I gave the Christians my revelation, the original revelation before the Jews changed it. So now the Christians have, and what did the Christians do? They came up with this cockamamie idea that I have a son. I have no son. You may be surprised to learn that Jesus, Isa, appears more in the Quran than does Muhammad. And more often than not, at every appearance of Jesus in the Quran, he'll say to Allah, "I never said I was your son. I would never say I was your son." And you may know that the first extant written record of Islam is on the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. At the base of the dome, in Arabic script, it says, I have no associates. I have no associate. Islam is, if anything, is radical monotheism in the affirmative, and in the negative, if it's anything, it's a denial of the Trinity and of the Incarnation. If you read Islam, it's constantly full of I have no associates, I have no partners. Every time that's said, it's meant there is no Trinity and there was no Incarnation. And another interesting thing, what do you think the Trinity is in the Quran, how it's mentioned in the Quran? Father, Son, and Mary. No wonder they're upset by what they think is the Christian notion. I would find that absurd too. Where did Muhammad get the idea that Christians think the Trinity is Father, Son, and Mary? Well, there was a heretical sect in northern Arabia called the Collyridians that believed something like this, and no doubt Muhammad, on one of his, he was a trader and he traveled a great deal. He probably ran into the Collyridians, and there it is in the Quran. So, Allah says, I'm going to do it one last time. I'm going to give you my original revelation, undiluted by the Jews and the Christians, one last time. To you, Muhammad, you're the seal of the prophets, because you're the last one. I'm not going to do it again. My final revelation. Therefore, Muslims regard our religion as superseded because now they have the original. And how do they regard the original? There was a huge dispute in the early 9th century about the Quran amongst Muslims. One side of the dispute said, well, the Quran was revealed in history. It's an historical document. Just like we regard the Bible, right? It was revealed at a certain time, certain place, to certain people in the language they spoke. And to understand it, you have to understand all the circumstances on which it was contingent. The culture, the customs, the things they were referring to. And that's how you can finally come to an understanding of what it meant. And so there was one school in Islam that regarded the Quran very much the way we regard the Bible. Still God's word, but it's a historical document. The other side said, oh no, it's not a historical document, it's ahistorical. It has existed as it is today. In the Quran, you would hold in Arabic, coexisting with God, Allah, in heaven forever. So God does speak Arabic. I mean that literally. So in other words, that school of Islam that says the Quran is literally has coexisted with God forever as it is today, changeless, means it's not contingent on the circumstance, on any historical circumstances. It's ahistorical. It's outside of time. It's not in the historical narrative, just as I was explaining, this loss of any sense of history. Therefore, the interpretive range you see is vastly diminished. And by the way, that means you don't examine the words etymologically. I have a great friend in England who is a wonderful scholar. He knows all the Semitic languages. When I have a question about the Quran, I'll say, tell me about this word. And he'll say, well, this word has Aramaic roots. It has, there is a Hebrew thing here, and he'll trace the etymology of the word back. Well, in the latter school of regarding the Quran that I just told you about, you can't do that because there is no etymological chronological development in a document that has existed co-eternally with Allah, right? Because there's no before, during, and after. It's always been that way. By the way, there was a wonderful German theologian, much beloved by Benedict XVI, Gerl Falkowitz, whom I met several years ago, who came up with the wonderful terms to use regarding the concept of the Quran versus Christianity. In Christianity, she said, we have the incarnation, God become man. In Islam, they have the in-liberation, God become book. No, seriously. So the Quran plays a role in Islam analogous to the role of Christ in Christianity. In liberation as opposed to incarnation. That, by the way, is why you see the reactions in the Muslim world from any desecration of the Quran, like that idiot pastor in Florida who, with his congregation of 10 people burned a Quran. And the reaction would be the same if you saw someone desecrating the Eucharist. You'd be very upset, wouldn't we? Of course we would. This is analogous to a desecration of the Quran for the Muslim. I'm not excusing this, I'm just explaining it so you can understand what is the holiest thing to them. Now there's another interesting thing that Gerl Falkowitz pointed out, and that is the character of the revelation. And she contrasts Gabriel's appearance in the Quran to Gabriel's appearance in Luke to Mary. So what happens to Muhammad when he has his first experience? First of all, he thinks it's demonic. He thinks this alien force has him in its grip and it's going to crush him and capsize his chest. And this president says to him, write. He says, I can't write. Then it happens again. And again he thinks he's going to be extinguished by this force. Right, I can't write. It happens again. Finally, this president, whom he's now convinced is Gabriel, says, recite. And of course that's what Quran means, the recital. And thus, so this is contrasted then with the appearance of Gabriel to Mary. By the way, the condition in which Muhammad describes himself, and of course he was described by others when he was having his visions, some of which seem to suggest he might have had epilepsy. In any case, he's in a trance. His rational faculties are suspended. In a typical Oriental encounter with the divine, it's just totally mystic. You're not engaged intellectually with it. You are overwhelmed, overpowered by it. Now, when Gabriel comes to Mary, she, of course, is startled. She is surprised. And she's frightened. But she's not overwhelmed. She's not in a trance. Her rational faculties are not suspended because when she is given this announcement, what does she do? She asks a question. How can this be? And only when it is answered in a way satisfactory to her, as mysterious as it was, then she assents. She gives a rational assent and says, let it be done according to your will. So she rationally consents. As within Christianity, faith is considered a rational assent of the will. Not so in the submission that is depicted within Islam. So you see the different character of these things? Now, with the little time that we have left, I've got to quickly tell you about this amazing history in Islam in the 9th century. And this is a story I lay out in detail in my book, The Closing of the Muslim Mind, which I'll be happy to sign for you after the talk. When the Muslims conquered such a large part of the Byzantine Empire and all of the Persian Empire, they encountered civilizations vastly superior to them. And in the case of Christianity, not only did they encounter Hellenic, Greek centers of learning, but also a Christian apologetics that was suffused with Greek philosophic ideas. So how were they going to defend their faith in the face of this sea of Christians in whom they were living? So the questions first rise within the Muslim world. What's the relationship between our revelation and reason? And what's the relationship between reason and God? Same questions Judaism asks, same questions Christianity asks. Now Islam begins asking them. And the first answers came from the first theological school in Islam called the Mu'tazilites. And their answer was as follows: God is rationality and justice. He gave us our reason to come to know him through the rational order of his creation. He gave us our reason to discover right from wrong, the just from the unjust. And he gave us our free will because it's incumbent upon us to choose the good and the just. And this isn't just an obligation for Muslims. It's an obligation for every person because every human being has the gift of reason and free will. Does that sound like the Islam you know? But it sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because the clear influences of Greek thought and Christianity are there. This reached its apogee in the beginning of the 9th century with Caliph al-Ma'mun, the greatest exponent and supporter of Greek thought in the history of Islam. He sponsored the first Arab philosopher, Al-Kindi. He started the House of Wisdom in Baghdad to translate all the Greek philosophical texts. Aristotle came to Al-Ma'mun in a dream. And he asked Aristotle, what is the good? And Aristotle said, it is what is rationally good. And that's the answer he embraced by sponsoring Arab philosophy, by sponsoring the rational school of theology called called the Mu'tazilites. Now, the leading Mu'tazilites said that the first obligation of man is to reason. Not to submit, but to reason. Why is that? It's because the existence of God is not self-evident. Therefore, you must engage in speculative reason to consider whether or not he exists. And when you read these Mu'tazilite theologians, you see they come up with reasons for the existence of God that sound very much like the ones Thomas Aquinas came up with in the 13th century. Then they ask themselves, well, how do we know? Okay, we know he exists. We can reason to that through his creation. Has he spoken? Well, he might have, but what about this claim to revelation here in the Quran? Is this genuine? How would we know? Again, their answer was through our reason. Does it say anything unreasonable or anything that would make us deny our reason to accept it? And sure, they found things in there that didn't make sense because it says God has hands and feet and he sits on a throne. That can't be true because he's a pure spirit. So they said that must not be meant literally. It must be meant metaphorically. So you bring what isn't in accord to reason in accord with reason. Again, does that sound familiar? Of course. That sounds very familiar to a Christian in respect to understanding the Bible. Now, the next school of Islam that arose, by the way, Al-Mamun, as caliph, made free will a state doctrine, as against the strong vein of predestination that was already present in Islam. He said, no, man is free. He'll be held to account. He also made a state doctrine that the Quran was created and did not exist co-eternally with God. The next school of theology that arose were the Asherites that denied every single point of the Mutazilites. God is not rationality and justice. He is pure will and power. He has nothing to do with reason. He is above, beyond reason. Man does not have the capability of knowing good from evil or the just from the unjust. His reason is incapable of knowing that. First of all, because man is corrupted by his self-interest. Second of all, because there's nothing to be known. God, Allah, is the first and only cause of all things. There are no secondary causes. There's no cause and effect in the natural world. Here we go. What's happening here? What just happened? Gravity. Okay. Everyone here has committed the sin of shirk, which is to assign something to something other than God. To say that there is a law of gravity means that you have associated a cause to a natural force that is not God himself. So according to Asherism, it's God who raised my hand, God who released my hand from the pen, and God who made the pen fall down. Now the next time, he may cause it to fly sideways or up to the ceiling. Because he can do anything. There are no natural laws. He does everything individually, specifically, and momentarily. Now, what do you think is happening here? Do you think I'm moving my hand? Shirk again. No, you didn't commit the sin of shirk. Some of you did. That's not what's really happening. Everything is constituted by time-space atoms that have no nature, you see. And whatever something is what Allah agglomerates it into for an instance. Then all of these time-space atoms are annihilated, and then they're reconstituted. And they can be reconstituted as anything Allah wants. Because things have their nature. So will this handsome young man stay a handsome young man while I finish the sentence? Don't look away. You wanted the discount for the book. There's your list. Or will he change into a potted plant? And if you say, well, no, he'll remain as he is, and your reason is because he has the nature of a human being, sure again. So what reality is, I see a few graybeards like myself in the audience who would remember 9mm films and the fact that each separate frame was a distinct shot, separate from the next frame, but slightly different from it, and only when it moved on the sprocket did it create the illusion of movement. And that's a good analogy to the metaphysics of these Asherites. That's what's happening in their metaphysics. Things are being annihilated and reconstituted almost instantaneously. It's only Allah who does it. Nothing is anything in and of itself. So there's no nature, there are no laws of nature. The Declaration of Independence would have been impossible here. And obviously there's nothing you can know about good and evil through your reason, because you can only know those things through the laws of nature. So what do you have? What do you have to know good and evil? Remember the angels? You only know what you told us. All you have is the revelation of the Quran and of the Hadith, or the Sunnah in Islam. So these kinds of Muslims, the majority of Sunni Muslims following the Asharite school, Al-Azhar in Cairo, the most important educational institution in the Sunni world, that follows the Asharite school, believes that you can only know right from wrong through revelation. And what you will see in Islam, in Sharia law, is that every potential thing you might think of doing has been codified in one of 5 ways, from halal to haram. And the only way you'll know of whether what you're going to do is send you to hell or to paradise is by knowing this Islamic revelation and law. But since everything you do, including bathroom habits and dietary things, is covered by these laws, it's very hard for any single individual to know them. So what you do is get advice. You seek a ruling from an imam or a qadi for them to tell you in a fatwa, can I do this or can't I do it? Because your reason can't tell you. There's a famous principle in Islamic jurisprudence: reason is not a legislator. Reason is not a legislator. By the way, if you're wondering why constitutional democratic government never developed indigenously in the Muslim world, this principle can help you get there. Because if reason is not a legislator, why have legislatures? Just as you can understand why science was stillborn in much of the Muslim world, if there are no laws of nature, why go looking for them? Why try to discover them? If God is doing everything directly, there's nothing for you to find out. Now, how far does this kind of thing go? In Pakistan, when General Zia al-Haq was the president dictator, the imams got very upset about the weather reports on Pakistani media and television and demanded that the weather forecasts be removed, which General Zia did for several years. Now, what's the problem? The problem is if God directly creates the weather, it's an act of giant presumption on your part to predict it, because no one knows what God is going to do. If God is incalculable, if he acts for no reasons, then you shouldn't be able to calculate the weather. Do you see how far this thing can go? Unfortunately, this school of thought triumphed. After Al-Mamun, there were 3 more caliphs who followed his school of thought, the Mu'tazilite school of thought. Then Caliph al-Mutawakkil, in the middle of the 19th century, suppressed the Mu'tazilites, and they had to run for their lives. And by force, the Asharite school of Islam prevailed. The school that denies cause and effect in the natural world, denies that you can know good and evil, and denies that you know anything outside of revelation regarding morals. They won. Philosophy was extirpated from the Muslim world. Poor Al-Kindi, the first Arab philosopher, his library was confiscated and he was driven through the streets of Baghdad with whips. And the teaching of philosophy forbidden. I'm just going to give you a couple of more contemporary incidents to help you grasp the effect of this culture that became dysfunctional because of this distorted theology, this distorted idea of who God is. I had a young Kurdish acquaintance who went on the Hajj in Mecca with a very pious friend. And they were circling the Kaaba. And his very pious friend reached over and touched the famous black stone. And it was cool to the touch, and he exclaimed, "Look, this is a miracle directly from Allah. Under the hot, blazing Saudi sun, the black stone is cool." So my more skeptical Kurdish friend touches it. Indeed, it's cool. How can that be? So he goes around the Kaaba until he finds a set of stairs going down, at the bottom of which he discovers a refrigeration unit. So he takes his pious friend, walks him down the stairs, points to it and says, "Look, this is why the black stone is cool." What was the reaction of the pious friend? Outrage. Outrage. It was a direct assault on his theology. Now, some of my friends who have trained the militaries in the Middle East and our Iraqi allies would encounter this kind of problem when you try to get an Iraqi soldier to wear his Kevlar vest. Well, of course, it's 110 degrees, and the attitude was, if my time has come, the Kevlar vest will not save me. And if my time hasn't come, why should I wear the Kevlar vest? And trying to get them to pay attention to marksmanship and things like this, and weapons maintenance problematic. Once again, famous passage in the Quran, Allah says, "It was not you who shot the arrow, it was I." So if the bullet's going to hit the target, it's because Allah's going to put it there, not because you've aimed it correctly, right? Same problem with seatbelts in the Middle East. Friends of mine who lived in the Middle East all their lives encountered this. If your time has come, the seatbelt's not going to save you. If it hasn't come, why wear the seatbelt? And so you also see the exclusive concentration on Allah as the first and only cause of things, and the interpretation of events. Katrina, the giant tsunami in South Asia. What happened there on the beaches of Indonesia and India? Well, it turns out that was high tourist time. People were drinking and fornicating on the beaches, so Allah sends this wave to destroy it. Right? They have to understand it through first cause. I actually went to an Islamist website and saw a satellite photo of the tsunami. Superimposed on it was the Arabic script for Allah, which was, you see, completely congruent with the tsunami. So the tsunami itself spelled Allah. And you can imagine the Muslim press about Katrina punishing these materialistic, atheistic, sex-obsessed, imperialistic Americans directly. Allah is punishing them. So I know it's getting late, and I don't want to go on too far, but is this all of Islam? No, it's not all of Islam, but it's a major portion of it, and why it's dysfunctional. I'll simply point out to you the Arab UN Human Development Reports, written all by Arabs. They're very powerful documents. Found that the 300 plus million Arabs come in next to last in every area of human development. Education, healthcare, GDP, number of books translated, number of patents registered, and in one instance, even at the bottom. The only thing that keeps them from being at the bottom is sub-Saharan Africa. So you have to ask yourself, how is it that this once great civilization has ended up in this dysfunctional fashion. Believe me, in the first half of the 9th century in Baghdad, the court of Al-Mamun was one of the most resplendent in the world. At that time, maybe the Chinese emperor could have competed, but it was a marvel. This was, when you hear about the golden age of Islam, this is what we're talking about. But what happened is Islam de-Hellenized itself and has now suffered the catastrophic consequences of that, just as we shall suffer the consequences if we continue to de-Hellenize ourselves. Now, just so you know, there's nothing Islamophobic about this. I want to read to you from King Hussein's last interview. King Hussein of Jordan, of course, he's a descendant of Muhammad. And he was asked by a journalist the following question: would you agree that the Muslim decline can be dated from the 9th century, when Islam missed the chance to become the religion of reason and moderation by crushing the Mutazilite movement? King Hussein: that is essentially correct, and we must do what we can to change that now. Unquote. There you have it. At the Westminster Institute, where I work, 3 of the 4 most recent speakers were Muslims. Do a lot of work with Muslim intellectual reformers, all of whom give it the same diagnosis as King Hussein did, and know that Islam needs to reopen fundamental theological questions about who God is and what is his relationship to reason, and to restore the role of reason in that faith, or I'll tell you, one Muslim philosopher said the future of Islam will be Aristotelian or it will not be. In the political aspect of it, let me refer to this brief statement by Abdul Karim Sarouche, Muslim philosopher. He's addressing the question of whether you can have democracy and Islam the way it's currently thought of. Here's his answer. You need some philosophical underpinning, even theological underpinning, in order to have a real democratic system. Your God cannot be a despotic God anymore. A despotic God would not be compatible with a democratic rule with the idea of rights. So you even have to change your idea of God. Unquote. Needless to say, that's a very tall order. And unfortunately, the idea of God, which has gained such purchase in the Muslim world today, is the one that was expressed by Osama bin Laden when he quoted his spiritual mentor in that first tape after 9/11. Terrorism is an obligation in Allah's religion. When I read that, I thought, I think I better study Muslim theology. How could that be? And it can only be if God is not a God of reason and justice, but it's only a God of pure will and power, because then there's nothing to stop making terrorism an obligation and bringing all things in submission to him. Please let me stop there and entertain any questions you have. You've been very patient. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
How is it that the United States it goes and makes treaties with a group of people who do not have an obligation because of the way they think keep their word with an infidel. So why make a treaty with them? This doesn't make sense to me.
Well, I mean, there are responsible governments in the Muslim world. And there are models, even within Muhammad's lifetime, of at least temporarily keeping a treaty. But when you're dealing with a kind of Islam which doesn't acknowledge the grounds on which, the grounds for keeping a treaty, you're a fool to make them. For instance, the current agreement with Iran, it's not a treaty, by the way. It's not, who knows, only John Kerry and President Obama know what it is. All we know is that the Iranians won't keep it, which, makes the greater fools of us. So I think there's not a uniform answer to your question, but the first, I worked for President Ronald Reagan, and I would repeat, trust but verify. Yes, sir.
Yes, so our democratic elections is compatible with
The question is, are democratic elections compatible with the philosophy of Islam? Well, that depends. It depends on which form of Islam you're speaking of. For instance, in Great Britain, with the Islamists, who are the fundamentalist Muslims, when it comes time for parliamentary elections, the imams tell people, you may not vote. Because voting is contesting God's law. Man's law is illegitimate, only God's law is legitimate. Therefore, to vote in an election for people who are going to make men's laws is haram, it's forbidden. On the other hand, you have countries like Indonesia, which are culturally different from the Arab world, where the prospect for, and you also have the many Muslims in India, who of course are living in a larger democracy, where some compatibility has been found. So I don't think you can give a blanket answer, but the whole intellectual impetus in the Muslim world is against that and not for it. So the changes that are sweeping through the Islamic world are against democratic constitutional development, not for it. And it has its roots, as you can see, in the school of theology that is dominated. Yes, ma'am.
So, if there is no idea of progress in Islam, if there's no sense that man has a relationship with God, then what is even the purpose of humanity?
What is the purpose of humanity is to submit and obey. I have to tell you, as I've worked with Muslims for years, I forgot to do something I usually do when I begin that may help you answer that question, despite all of the enormous problems I have pointed out. By the way, we went outside of Mass here at St. Mary's one Sunday, and we stopped people coming out from the church and said, by the way, are you an Augustinian or a Thomist? What do you think they'd say? Huh? And to keep this in perspective, if we went out and stopped a Muslim and said, are you a Mutazilite or are you an Asherite? Like, what? In other words, they're just trying to live life as best they can with the God they know, and these metaphysical and philosophical things. Many Muslims, they don't even know this stuff. I hasten to say I know far more about Islam than many Muslims do at this philosophical and theological level. So Does that help answer at all the part about?
It's to obey God, in a sense, for fear of damnation. It's really important.
Yes, he's a very fearful God. That's for sure. But also you have to remember every surah of the Quran, except the first one, begins with Allah, the All-Merciful. Now Allah can be merciful or not, and no one can say when he'll be one or when he'll be the other. When he's pure will and power, he doesn't have to be. You can simply hope for it. So it's very problematic, and it's in many manifestations, it's a religion of fear. As much as Muslims love God, they don't. It's a one-way street. I mean that literally in Asherite theology. God can't love man, even though man has a duty to love God. That's because God's perfect and complete in himself. Therefore, he wouldn't, love this little creature down there. So that's part of the complexity of this figure. On the other hand, I have to just say this very quickly. So if you have this arid, stark theology, what happens to that thirst for union with God that's in almost every human soul? Well, you've heard of Sufism. Haven't you? Sufism in the Muslim. This is frowned upon by Orthodox Sunnism, but Sufism is the mystical side of Islam. And there are Sufi mystical orders in Turkey and North Africa, and they concentrate on this mystical union with God, which is not copacetic with Sunni Muslim theology. But the thirst for that, let's say, overcomes the theology, which is why the Muslim imams are not happy with Sufism. But that's a very beautiful side of Islam, and Sufi mystical poetry is extremely beautiful. And also, by the way, heavily influenced by Christian mysticism as well. Sorry, the back of the room, sorry.
I have one more question.
That's it?
How does this religion ever align itself with communists, the socialists?
With what?
Align itself with socialists, the communists, the totalitarians?
Well, how does it align itself with totalitarian regimes? Well, that's the next to last chapter in the closing of the Muslim mind. But very quickly, first of all, those totalitarian regimes are usually anti-Christian and anti-Western. So that would make perhaps for a natural alliance, even though they're atheistic regimes. Number two, those regimes, whether Nazism, which was much admired in the Arab world and still is, or communism, are based on the primacy of will, pure will, over reason. And since this form of Islam is also based on the primacy of will over reason, you can see at that level there's a natural alliance. Does that help?
Yes.
If not, the books there, I'm happy to sign books for you, either on music or Islam or that other unfortunate subject whose name should not be mentioned, but is. Thank you very, very much. Oh, wait, we're sorry, did you?
When we were in Israel, we saw a sign, huge, as large as that screen. And it was essentially saying that if you are not Muslim, you are doomed to damnation. Did they honestly believe that
If
anyone
you are-
who is not Muslim is damned?
It's on a sign that if, in Jerusalem, if you're not a Muslim, you'll be damned. Well, I have bad news for you in particular. In I forget if it was the Hadith or the Quran, that hell is filled primarily with women. Why? I'm going to have have to call your attention to the Quran and the Hadith, but do they seriously believe that if you're yes, I think so. Well, technically, yes. You see, you have to understand this. Islam, it's called the Deen al-Fitra, the religion natural to man. It's the religion. So in other words, you were born a Muslim. Everyone here was born a Muslim. Adam was a Muslim. Abraham was a Muslim. Jesus was a Muslim.
They believe it.
Oh yeah, that's a Deen al-Fitra, where you are born a Muslim. And then probably, in fact, I said this to a Catholic cardinal once. I said, Your Eminence, you were born a Muslim and your mother apostatized you. You should have seen the look he gave me. But that's what it is. So if someone converts to Islam, they don't convert, they revert to Islam. You see what I mean? So, in other words, you have denied the religion that is natural to you. It's a substitution for human nature, the Deen al-Fitr, this religion. So that you are obstinate and not accepting Islam, plus the fact you're a woman. Yeah, it doesn't look good for you, I'm afraid. But if you buy the book, you can find your way out of this dilemma. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.